Good morning, guys. So today I'm going to be talking about my thesis on the citizen science monitoring of freshwater mussels from the group Unionidae in the Huron River Watershed. So freshwater mussels, also known as unionids, they're a fairly underrepresented and underappreciated group of animals, although they play some pretty major and significant roles in aquatic ecosystems. And some of those roles include their ability to filter feed, so they'll feed on algae, bacteria, and organic from the matter from the water column. And this in turn makes them a link in the food chain for predators such as muskrats and raccoons. They also provide habitat for a variety of macroinvertebrates, such as worms and insect larvae that will live on the shells of the mussels. They can be pretty good habitat quality indicators as well because of their sensitivity to things like pollution and alterations to habitat. And they have some pretty unique interactions with fish hosts that I will describe in a moment, but they play a role in their reproductive cycle. So in Michigan, we have 43 known species of unionids, and 31 of those are actually listed as threatened, endangered, or special concern. And this is primarily due to a variety of anthropogenic threats, including overharvesting. They get used in different decorative industries, such as being made into buttons. Dams, which play a major role in preventing the spread of unionids. And I'll explain this a bit more in depth in a moment, but they restrict the movement of their fish hosts. There's exotic species that can outcompete with unionids, including zebra mussels, Asian clams, and quagga mussels. Pollution also plays a role, particularly with herbicide use and poison that gets used to control sea lamprey. There's some parasites that can reduce the metabolism of unionids, including worms, water mites, and bitterlings. And there's also a variety of different ways that climate change plays a role, but notably how it impacts temperature because of the metabolism impacts of mussels, and then how it affects stream hydrology with occurrences of drought and flooding. And then also just general habitat factors such as flow, temperature, hydrology, and substrate. So as I mentioned, river impoundment is a very big concern for unionids, and this is because of how it impacts fish movements. So the way that unionids will reproduce is they have this specialized lure on their mantle. It's in the shape of a little fish like a minnow or a crayfish or an insect, such as in the photo here. And those unionids, they'll be displaying this in the water, and the fish will swim down thinking it's food, and they'll bite on it. And when they bite, the female mussel will release their larvae. And these larvae, called glaucidia, will then attach to the fish on their body, on their fins, or on their gills. And when the mussels swim upstream and go to other streams in the watershed, the developing larvae will then drop down and then burrow into the sediment to become adult mussels. So since dams restrict the movement of those fish, they're in turn restricting the spread and the growth of unionid populations as well. So some of the conservation measures that exist to address those threats include removing those dams, especially the ones that are old or no longer in use. By doing that, you can improve connectivity between streams and allow those fish hosts to move. Relocation as well, especially for threatened populations, usually with construction projects, those mussels can be moved to different streams. You can implement riparian buffers and put in urban gardens to reduce the input of pollution into sediment. Try to control for exotic species, especially with zebra mussels, to prevent them to getting into other streams. Just general protections as well to make sure that those fish host populations are sufficient to facilitate the reproductive cycle of mussels. And there's also some new developments with lab propagation as well, especially in Michigan. Central Michigan University is actually working with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources to create Michigan's first hatchery for mussels. And then monitoring, which is the basis of this project, to assess where mussels are distributed. So in the Huron River, we have 34 total observed species. 22 of those are currently unlisted, but 12 are state threatened or endangered. And of those 12, 4 are federally threatened or endangered, including actually the round hickory nut mussel, which was just recently, on April 10th of this year, listed as threatened federally. So for this project, I don't know why it's messed up like that, but for this project, there was kind of a twofold goals that I tried to go for. And doing this, collaborated with the Huron River Watershed Council. For the ecological portion, we tried to develop a monitoring program to use volunteers and staff from the Huron River Watershed to facilitate and participate in these mussel surveys, and then also some educational components and social values, engaging local communities and producing some educational materials to teach people about unionids and get them involved. So some of the steps that I took to address those goals include designing the survey protocol. I went out and did some surveys and then created some procedures for the program. I got some information based on permits that you would require and the types of streams that exist. I went out and visited some sites and then recommended them based on a set of criteria. And then I created and acquired some educational materials. So for the surveys, I was able to train with Dr. Renee Mulcrone, who is a mussel expert in Michigan. And she took me out on some mussel surveys to teach me how to conduct them. And some of those photos from one of those surveys are showed to the right at Ypsilanti, or in Ypsilanti at Riverside Park. So first, when you get to the site, you want to note some information about the habitat, and that includes stream depth, the flow speed of the river, temperature, the surrounding vegetation, things of that nature. Then you can put on your waders and go out into the river and look for mussels. And there are some tools you can use to do this. You can have these glass bottom buckets, which allow you to look under the water and search for the mussels that are trying to burrow and hide in the sediment. You can pick them up by hand, you can dig them up because they like to be burrowed, but you just have to be gentle with them. Then you'll bring them back to the stream bank, putting them in buckets or these mesh bags. You'll lay them out on the stream bank, and you'll start grouping them into similar looking species and try to identify them. And there are some tools to help with that I will describe later. You want to take photos to help with the species identification as well if needed, and then record some information. And I actually created a form, of a report form that is an example of stuff that you want to include in those recording information, such as the number of species you find and the number of individuals per species. And lastly, you want to bring those mussels back to the water. And when doing this, it's very important to lay them flat or upright in a position where they can either reorient themselves or they're sticking up out of the sediment, because otherwise they'll suffocate because they need to siphon out oxygen from the water. So then I was able to identify some sites, and I did this using some past historical surveys in the Huron River Watershed, as well as this map that was created by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and it shows some designations for 3 groups of streams. And these stream groups are helpful for learning about what species might be there based on conservation status, as well as the permits that you need to survey in them. So there's 3 stream groups. Stream group 1 is for state special concern or unlisted species. And for this, you would need the collector's permit to survey, and that's from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I was able to acquire this permit and document the process for that. There's the stream group 2, which covers state-listed species. And this is also from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and I was able to acquire this permit and document process for that as well. And then lastly, for stream group 3, this is for federally listed species. This is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And typically these permits are more reserved for the experienced mussel experts in the field, such as Dr. Renee Mulcrone, who trained me. But there are people such as Renee who I've identified that would be able to come and help lead us surveys if we need to go to those streams. And then I actually went out and visited some of those sites. I had some Huron River Watershed Council members, volunteers, Matt and Larry, to come in, visit those sites and help me with that. And then we ranked those sites and made some recommendation on some different criteria, including things like accessibility, for parking, for how long it might take to walk to a stream, what the stream access is actually like of getting into the stream, what stream group it is from those 3 different designations. Just overall habitat quality as well, especially with substrate. If the stream is too muddy, too much muck, I wouldn't want to recommend that for volunteers to go out and wade into, and there probably won't be mussels there to begin with. Also some past survey information that's available that I was able to go through, and then site ownership. So a lot of them were public parks, so there's easy access to those. Some of them were private access behind homes and such, so you'd have to request access for those. And then I was also able to create and acquire some program materials, including field guides, brochures, and this set of 3D models that I created here with the Ann Arbor Art Gallery Cultureverse. And these will help in identifying mussels out in the field or for information that's displayed online. So regarding the results that will be acquired from these surveys, it would be a mussel abundance, species distribution, and all this information would help to get protections for threatened or endangered species where they're not previously observed, and also inform any restoration efforts where they might be needed. So some of the materials I was able to acquire and create, there's field guides that already exist for Michigan mussels, but I was able to adapt a new set that's just for the Huron River watershed species, and then with those I have some simplified descriptions for volunteers to use when they're trying to identify those species. There's a collection of brochures and posters that have all the Michigan mussels that I was able to acquire, collect a set of for those volunteers as well. And then these 3D models that we were able to print, and then I painted myself to resemble live specimens of all the common and unlisted species. And these will also be displayed online and in a virtual gallery that will be developed with Cultureverse, where we get to annotate those shells with morphological features. And then lastly, I painted this digital painting of a mural. This will also be displayed in the virtual gallery, and I hope to use this as another form of scientific engagement through art. And this one in particular shows a pocketbook mussel and its bluegill host in that life cycle. So for some of the impacts of the project, the results from the data that gets collected from the surveys show some things like high water quality, as well as the substrate that might be present in those streams, and especially the presence of host fish if they're sufficient for facilitating mussel reproduction. And these can hopefully inform conservation efforts, mostly for garnering protections for those threatened and endangered species, but also things like relocating if they're necessary to get those populations from any threatened sites, especially for construction projects. And then there's also the social component as well. We get to engage volunteers and involve them in meaningful conservation work, especially with young scientists or kids who might not know what a mussel is, and then they feel inspired to do something like this for their career, hopefully. And then also spreading some social awareness about unionids, teaching them people about what they are and getting them involved in the program. So in conclusion, I was able to produce a variety of different things for this throughout this project, including the survey protocol and the recommendations for that, instructions on what permits you need and how to apply for those permits and what report information you need to provide, the list of sites that you need to, or that I recommended, and as well as all of those educational materials that I was able to acquire and produce. So in the future, hopefully I'll be able to go in the summer and try and help get the program up and running some mussel surveys with staff and volunteers. Through that, we'll be able to try and refine those program details, see what works, see what might need to be added or changed. I'll also be trying to develop that virtual gallery with Cultureverse to display all this information online and hopefully bring more attention to the program. And then overall, I hope that these results will help the Huron River Watershed in their conservation efforts, and then just be a benefit for unionids and the Huron River Watershed community as well. So some special thanks to my advisor, Sara and C's for facilitating this project, Jason and Paul from the Huron River Watershed Council for collaborating with me, Cultureverse and my contact there, Serena, for producing the 3D models with me, Renee for training me and taking me out on surveys, and Joseph Rathburn, who provided all of those brochures and posters for the volunteers, and my family for supporting me. Any questions?
Very excited. I can't wait to see your dreams. So I have a question about your volunteer cities and lives project. Once they start sending information back, which is mussels they have found, are you planning any kind of raw data they are sending? Is anybody going to verify that they are identifying the mussels right?
Yeah, so in those, we would likely be running events for the volunteers to join, and then have someone like a staff member or someone like me, if I'm volunteering, to help run those and then get that data with them. There are states where, I think Wisconsin is a state where you don't need a permit at all, and like anybody could go out and get information or take photos and use things like iNaturalist and post that online. In Michigan, like just a volunteer who doesn't have a permit or anything or doesn't know how to identify mussels, they wouldn't actually be able to go out. So through this, hopefully we'll be able to like facilitate a way to make that kind of easier in getting that data and being able to report that.
Love the integration of art. I have a purely selfish question. Are endangered mussels in Riverside Park?
I did. So actually, this one right here, that's one of my favorite species on the left. The black sandshell, that is a state endangered species, and it's huge. It's like this big.
And was it in that spot?
Yeah, it was like in Riverside Park. It's just laying in the river there, and I was able to find it. It was really cool. Any other questions?
A couple questions. Sorry.
No worries.
You mentioned threatening mussel populations was like dams that have been abandoned that are still, I guess, reducing hydrological connectivity or something. How many abandoned dams are there in Michigan?
Ooh. I'm not sure how many are abandoned, but I believe most of them are not being used to like actually facilitate like energy production, if I'm correct. I think most in Michigan are either there because people just didn't care to move it, and use the resources to take them down, or because it creates like ponds and lakes that people enjoy to have for whatever activities they're using there, and they don't want that to change, so they're still there. Yeah.
So second question. So I guess the site isn't up yet. What's it called?
No. The Cultureverse, they have their own site, but the virtual gallery that I'll be creating them with them is not up yet, no.
Are you doing anything to maybe ensure engagement with that virtual gallery, or do you have any plans to do something?
I don't have any plans currently, just because it's in the like very early stages of it. It's going to take like months, they said, to create it, but hopefully either through events or social media stuff, I'll be able to, get some of that out yet.
Cool. Awesome art, by the way.
Thank you.
Are any of these mussels edible?
I haven't heard of anybody eating them. They get used to make like pearls or buttons and stuff, and raccoons eat them. I'm not sure if humans, I don't think I read anything about humans eating them. Yeah. Thank you.
Amani, I work at the Huron River Watershed Council. I really appreciate all your time and effort here, Amani. As we talked about, Renee Mulcrum came around to us over the last 20 years saying we're never going to have any mussel biologists because there's no way to get them through. There's no way to train them. There's no way to. And so through your time on this, the recognition that there's this accidental gatekeeping that's happening within this biology is really important, and I love that you've created multiple redundancies to break that down. That changes the whole game going forward, and it also hopefully sets forward a way that we can do that for other types of biologies, because this isn't the only one where we have this problem. It's related to the threatened endangered species permitting process. I'll give you a hard question. Dr. Steen wanted to know management recommendations. And I was like, what can we do with this data? And I definitely hear you. We want to take out as many dams as possible, and this is going to give us good data to help us support our dam removals, including the one in Ypsilanti. I'm wondering what other things you've come across that we can look into that, I get that it says like water quality is good or bad, but like what else can we use this to do a thing on the ground or in the water or like that? Things have you seen?
So I think that in general, I was trying to find information actually to see if there was a way that you could rank or like score these kind of surveys that like people do for macroinvertebrates. From what I've heard from mussel experts, mussels aren't like species distribution and the differences between species isn't the same like that, so it's not as easy to implement. So just the presence of mussels in themselves and like having like 4 species there kind of shows that there's high water quality. And so in that, I recommend things like either getting those protections for any observed species in threatened or endangered species in streams where they're not observed before. That's like one of the big things. You actually have to like contact the state when you find that. Also, if there's like streams where there might be in like urban areas or like for instance in the ARB, maybe finding ways to put like rain gardens or things to like prevent pollution or sediment from entering those streams. And then relocation as well, I feel is a pretty big tool that could be used through this. So like whenever projects are being done over streams for like bridges and things like that, those mussels need to be removed away from those sites. So using like volunteers to go out and find all those species could be a really big tool for that, I think.
That one. So in Ypsilanti, you've got the Peninsula Park Dam that I think is going to be removed, and it's just upstream of the Riverside Park place. Is there a risk?
Yeah, so removing dams, it definitely has like a 2-part, like a double-edged sword. It can facilitate the movement, but there's also sediment that will be displaced through that. So in that, there are definitely preventative measures. I'm not sure what the exact like amount of distance that you would want away from the dam to be like safe for mussels is, but you would certainly want to make sure that if you're removing dam, you're looking at any potential sites along that kind of stream to see if there's risk for that. Yeah.
One of the things that I think you and I talked about really briefly, but I'm really excited about this, is that when we talked to the DNR, so they do surveys when these types of projects happen. They do pre and post surveys, but they don't have the capacity to do long-term monitoring. Right. And obviously they're super old organisms, so long-term monitoring in construction locations is really important. And this gives the community the opportunity to rectify that lack of data, which I think is really important. So.
Yeah.
Kudos to the intent.
Yeah, I've seen they live from like 20 to 50 years, so that's definitely data that can help with that. Okay, one last question.
So in bigger, fancier dams that are still in operation, they have to use like fish corridors, I guess, for shore connectivity without actually destroying the dam. Is that?
Yeah, I think it would depend on the species. So there's what they call fish host generalists and fish host specialists. So if there are species that are able to use those corridors of fish, then that would help those mussels for sure. And then there's also mussels that might have only one species. So if that species potentially isn't able to swim that far or swim through, if it's too large or too small or for whatever the instance of that corridor, they're not able to go through that, then it might not help them specifically. But that's a good point. All right, thank you.